When a Muslim ruler believes that he's intrinsically cultivated to rule, he is born to rule, and with iron fist, and not only to rule, but he's representing God on earth. Whatever he's saying and he's doing, this is the will of God, and people have to accept that and live with that. He's representing God. In most Muslim countries today, for those of you who travel to Muslim countries, the leader or the president or the monarch is called Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithfuls, meaning the one who succeeds Prophet Muhammad. He's ruling in the name of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad and God. And then you see the absence of pluralism. Islam, a religion that believes in a pluralism. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Main principle in Quran. Whoever wants to believe, let him believe, do so. Whoever wants to reject God, let him do so. We don't coerce anyone to believe. This was the principle in the teachings of Muhammad, peace be upon him. But today we find the absence of pluralism, absence of democracy. We have to submit in certain traditional Islamic societies today. They look at it as being a religious duty to submit, not to the will of God, but to the will of the president and the leader, the political leader. Definitely we're going to have some people who are going to be sedated by this type of thinking, and some people like ISIS, Al-Qaeda are going to revolt against this. This is one reason. The absence of democracy from most of the Muslim societies. Today we have 55 countries with Muslim majorities. The vast majorities of those 55 countries are non-democratic, anti-democratic. The other reason for this, for the emergence of extremism within Muslim societies, is misguidance and ignorance. Do you know, my friends, that most of the Muslims, they learn about Islam only once a week for only 15 minutes or 20 minutes when they go to the Friday service. That's the only venue for them, for the vast majority of them. I'm not speaking about the educated, I'm speaking about the lay people. They go to the mosque to listen to the sermon. In most countries, these sermons have been given to the imam or the preacher by the government to praise the government, the sultan. Most of the scholars, not all of them, most of the scholars in most Islamic countries, they work not for God, they work for the government, for the sultan. And you know, if you look at some of the narrations in our Islamic books, it says that you must submit to the ruler. You have a duty to submit to him. Even if he hurts you, even if he tortures you, your duty is to listen to him and say yes sir to him. So these factors of these elements, different elements of misguidance, not understanding the true message of Islam by the Muslims themselves. Muslims, they lack critical studies of their own religion. They lack that. Because they don't have the freedom, they don't have the facility. If someone wants to speak his mind, he's under arrest. This is why we have these waves of immigrants leaving Muslim countries, heading to North America, to Europe. Many of them are drowning in the Mediterranean, not because of the economic factor that my previous speakers, they referred to. Not only the lack of economy, but also the lack of dignity and human rights in many Muslim countries. This is why we have extremism. And until we eradicate dictatorship, we would not be able to put an end to extremism in the Muslim world. This is a disease, this is a cancer that is spreading day by day. What happened in France, it could happen in America, in Orange County. It could happen in our backyard here, because we did not address the core issue. The Americans, the Europeans, they want to fight Islamic extremism and terrorism, but they have good relationship with some dictators in the Middle East. They consider them to be their allies. It does not work like that. We have to pay the price. I hope we enjoy from the discussion and from Jihad, and I hope I did not use my entire 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Imam Syed Mustafa Al-Qazwini. That was illuminating. And we now turn to Dr. Jihad Turk, our fourth and final speaker for the evening, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. So go ahead, Dr. Jihad Turk.
What they said. She was happy. She said, yes, he's not going to say anything at all. No. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. So I have the unenvious position of going after some, I wasn't going to take your pen, don't worry, of going after three incredible minds and hearts and leaders and visionaries in the Muslim community. And I thought, listening to them, and they've covered, I think, a broad spectrum of what is at the heart of this issue of peacemaking, voices for peace, countering violent extremism. So I thought I would complement what was done earlier, and I had to scrap all of my notes to having for the sake of not repeating. But I thought I would complement what was conveyed in this by this panel by sharing with you something that would help us with our religious literacy, both within the Muslim community and for those who are not from the Muslim community. So I want a little. This is both a survey, but also a little bit of social a social experiment. How many? I'm going to tell the story of the Prophet Muhammad. Who is Muhammad? How do we view him? How do we look to him and perceive him, and how are we inspired by him as a community of faith? So before he gave me 8 of his minutes, so in my 18 minutes, no? All right, I tried. I'm going to summarize the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But before I do so, I just want to see a raise of hands. How many of you have read an entire biography, at least one, of the Prophet Muhammad? Raise your hands high. All right. Now, how many of you have not read an entire biography of the Prophet Muhammad? All right, I think I got everyone to raise their hands. There's a few people who are shy there. All right, so some of you have read, almost I'd say even more than half of you have read a biography. But I want to distill this biography into a narrative, into a story that I think reveals the true character of this person that I have grown to have not only deep respect for, but love for, as not just a leader of my faith, but as a human being who was compassionate for and loved other human beings. And he was my role model as a humanitarian in that regard. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born as an orphan. In the Arab tradition, if your father passes away, you're an orphan. And so his father passed away before he was even born. And he was born in a small village named Mecca, in the heart of which was a sanctuary that was dedicated to the worship of God. Muslims believe, and Arabs believe, was built by the Prophet Abraham as a sanctuary to worship God. So the Arabs, though, since the time of Abraham to Muhammad, had not only worshipped God, but they had gotten to the habit of worshiping idols as well. And so Muhammad is born into this tribe. Arabia is mostly a nomadic society, and there are different tribes that are nomadic. But Mecca was a settled city, and in part because the Kaaba was there, but there was also a source of water, and it was also considered a safe place. Because the Arab tribes, when they were going on their caravans and their travels, they would oftentimes be in war against one another, and it would be kind of open season, the Wild West, the Wild Middle East is what maybe it would be a better expression. So they found in Mecca a safe place, and the people of Mecca, the Quraysh tribe, they really reaped the benefits of that because they had a great marketplace, they had water, they had this place to worship God, and the tribes each had their own idols. They would leave their idols at the Kaaba, at the sanctuary, for safe protection, and they would get blessings on their journeys. That's the context into which Muhammad was born. So he was a young man. His mother died when he was 6. He was raised by other family members, his grandfather, his uncle, and he was on the margin, because if you're an orphan in this tribal society, your tribe was your unit, and your father is the one who gave you entree into power and authority and leadership and wealth. And so his father, having died before he was born, left Muhammad, although from a reputable family, he was on the margin of society. And he maybe felt, because of that, in his upbringing, felt what it was like to be marginalized, to be disempowered, to be disenfranchised, and maybe became more sensitive to those who had that plight. And so although he was a successful, at first, a shepherd, then a merchant, and then he ultimately married into a well-to-do family, and he had luxury. He had luxury time for the first time in his life when he was a young man. And what did he do at the age of 25 when he was married and had luxury time? He retreated. He didn't indulge in a luxurious lifestyle. No, he retreated to the mountains and he reflected upon the ills of his society. And what were the ills of his society? Well, they had some great virtues. Arabs were very generous to their hosts, to their guests. They were chivalrous. They were brave, and they valued family. But there were a few values that really troubled the Prophet Muhammad. Number one, before he was a prophet, when they really troubled this young man, Muhammad. Number one was the treatment of orphans, himself having been one, the treatment of slaves, the treatment of women, and the treatment of people who were not part of the same tribe. There was a lot of injustices in that society. But let's just highlight for a moment the role of the status of women in that society. Women, it was considered shameful to have a daughter as a firstborn, and honorable to have a son as a firstborn. And if you had, in Arabian society, your firstborn as a daughter, it was normal practice to dig a hole and bury her alive, hoping that your next born would be a male. It's called female infanticide. This troubled the Prophet. He saw this practice, and although it was commonly done, it troubled him. He didn't just go with the flow. It's what everyone thought was the right thing to do, but no, he had a different sensitivity. And so he retreated to this mountain until finally he received revelation and inspiration from God to go and not just preach the worship of only one God and not to worship false idols. That's the core of the message. But to transform his society and his community, to stand up for the rights of the women and the female children and the orphans and the slaves. And so if you read the early revelations of the Quran, it's a social justice message. And who was attracted to his message? The down and out, the poor, the marginalized, women. And they followed his message. They found resonance with his message because it spoke to their plight. And who opposed his message? It was the people with the status quo. The people of Quraysh, the leadership, they had a good thing going. All of a sudden, someone comes from among their own ranks who's recognized and respected in their community, who is considered a trustworthy member of the leading tribe of Quraysh, of the leading clans. He came and said, these idols are false gods. Don't worship false gods. They said, this is terrible for business. So all of the tribes here, they entrust us with their idols. This is not going to look good for us, and we're not going to do well here. So they opposed his message. They persecuted his followers. They tortured his followers, and even to the point of death. And so he, as a human being, with a message of transforming society, was, with this weighty message, struggled to try and fulfill this mission. And so the people of Quraysh would persecute his followers, torture those who they could. Some of them were under the protection, the Prophet Muhammad was under the protection of his uncle, who wasn't a believer in his message, but fulfilled the tradition of Arabia by protecting his nephew from any harm. And so they weren't able to physically harm him, but they boycotted him and all of his followers for years. They boycotted. And the message from Muhammad was, that was sent through revelation, evil and good are not the same. Repel evil with goodness until the one who is like your worst enemy becomes like your best friend. And they were boycotted. No one did business with them, married into their tribe, gave them food. For 2 years, they were on the side of the mountain, expelled from their homes. But finally, the conscience of the people of Mecca crumbled a little bit, and the boycott was broken. But nonetheless, the persecution of the top leadership continued to the point where he had to flee. But where was he going to turn? He sent some of his followers to the protection of a Christian king in Ethiopia. He said, he is a man of God, he will protect you. So for the weakest of his followers, he sent them away for protection. But there were many more, and he was looking for a home in Arabia, the land where he was at home, his culture, his language. And so his message of peace resonated not just with the down and out in Mecca, but people would travel from the city of Yathrib or Medina to the north, and this small village had a number of tribes, Jewish tribes, but two particularly large Arab tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj, that had been fighting for generations. They were feuding. And they heard about his message of reconciliation, of common humanity, something that allowed them to transcend the unit of the tribe, and some of their leaders sought him out, and they embraced his teaching, and they next year, he sent them back next year, they came larger numbers and larger numbers. For 3 years in a row they came, until finally there was a group of about 70 of them who came, men and women from both tribes, and they said, we see in you a peacemaker, someone who can reconcile between our tribes that are feuding. It's an endless cycle of violence. Come to our city and reconcile between us and be our leader. And so the Prophet Muhammad sent his followers there, and then he himself followed. And it became, all right, 1 minute, plus the 8. So that's it, I'll stop here. No, I'm just kidding. So he went there, and his first speech was a short one, but it was a good one. His first speech, and maybe I should learn from him because it was only 4 sentences long. But his first speech was, number 1, feed those who need food. Number 2, maintain good family relations. Number 3, increase the greetings of peace between yourselves. And number 4, pray at night when other people are asleep, so that you have the repository, that well of faith that you can draw from to do all of those 3 things that are hard work. Sharing your wealth and food with those who are in need, going above and beyond and extending greetings of peace, and lastly, maintaining family connections, because family is sometimes hard to get along with. But so he had this message, and the Quraysh tried to attack him. There were a number of conflicts, and I really am wrapping up in just 30 seconds here. There was a number of conflicts and war, and yes, there was some, the Prophet did engage in defensive battles. And finally, when the opportunity came, he took the moral high ground. And this is why, this is the example that I look to in the Prophet's life and teachings. When the opportunity came, he donned the garb of pilgrimage, him and his followers, and they marched to Mecca with no weapons, and they forced the hand of Quraysh, who was too afraid to go against the overwhelming tribal tradition of allowing pilgrims freely to go to Mecca. It was a sacred area. So they couldn't refuse them, and they couldn't attack them, and they said, we don't want you to come in, but what can we do? The Prophet said, let's enter into a peace agreement. And they entered and they signed a 10-year peace agreement. And when after a few years the Quraysh broke it, the Prophet's community, which had grown because of the beauty that he taught, when they broke that treaty, he marched with an army of 10,000 on Mecca and said, amnesty for everyone. Not a single drop of blood was shed. And that is how he returned to his home country, and that is my example of the Prophet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. And another applause for all of our co-panelists, so Dr. Siddiqui, Dr. Khawaja, Dr. Al-Qazwini, and Dr. Turk all together. event, that the audience